Hello. In 1184, the Spanish Muslim traveller Ibn Jibbar spent several weeks in the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem on his journey home from a period in the Central Islamic lands. Some years later, he recorded his observations on what he saw there, and in one passage, he describes an arrangement by which frontier land between the Christian and the Muslim states appeared to be jointly cultivated. He wrote, quote, "The cultivation of this valley is divided between Franks and Muslims, and in it there is a boundary known as the boundary of dividing. They apportion the crops equally, and the animals are mingled together, yet no wrong takes place because of it." End quote. This arrangement was the result of a partition truce, often referred to in modern scholarship as a condominium. But what were partition truces? What were their purposes? And how did they operate when agreed between two sides with different legal frameworks? With me to discuss partition truces during the 12th and 13th centuries is Dr. Bogdan Smarandache, research fellow in the Département des Sciences de l'Antiquité, Langue Arabe et Études Islamiques, working on the Diplomaticon project at Liège University in Belgium. Bogdan, thank you very much for joining me today. We think of the period of the Crusades almost exclusively as a period of conflict between Christian and Muslim states, but it was very far from that, wasn't it? I mean, there were truces, treaties, even alliances between the states during the period of 200 years of Frankish settlement in the Levant. So what do we know about diplomacy between the two sides in this period?
First off, Alex, thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss diplomacy and this fascinating type of agreement as well. So I'm very glad to be on here. When it comes to diplomacy in the period of the Crusades, I'd actually suggest that we can even flip the narrative around and propose that there was even more diplomacy during this period, without, of course, disregarding the violence and the conflict that was caused by the Crusades. And this is because we have such a huge number of agreements attested in the period between the conquest of Jerusalem in 1099 by the first Crusaders and the conquest of the last of the Frankish bastions by the Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil in 1291. So within that 200-year period, the historian Ivan Friedman has counted, 120 treaties. But if we expand our definition and include surrender agreements, guarantees of safe passage, commercial concessions, truces, and treaties as two separate kinds of agreements, and then, of course, alliances, we may have an even larger number of agreements for that period, suggesting that the frequency of negotiation was quite high, actually.
So, do you think that diplomacy was just as or even more important and more regularly seen in this period than warfare was?
Yes, that's hard to say because I think that first of all, it was normal for Christian and Muslim rulers to join in truces or even in alliances. So I think that um, let's say, confessional boundary that we perceive so easily nowadays, looking back into history, was maybe not as present when it came to practical and strategic considerations. And this is something that Michael Köhler has shown very clearly in his book on Frankish Muslim treaties, in which he shows that basically if if two say a Christian and a Muslim town during the period are threatened by a third party, say the Byzantine Empire, for example, then they will tend to enter into an alliance because there are two smaller parties, both of which risk losing their territories to the larger party. And here the confessional identities of the leaders involved doesn't factor in as much as the threat that they both perceive.
Okay, so the both the Christian and the Muslim states were much more interested in protecting themselves politically, militarily, than they were in fighting for religious reasons then.
Mm. Yes, I would be cautious about venturing that far. I think that ideology still played a role, and I think that uh, perhaps one could see waves of say religious, what we would call religious fervor, or waves um, of of let's say interest or enthusiasm for holy war that spring up, especially when crusades are preached or when leaders on the Muslim side gather armies with the express intention of attacking the Franks.
Mm,
And by the way, I'm using Franks to refer to the Crusaders as well as their descendants and successors who remained in the Eastern Mediterranean coastal plain.
mm.
So yes, I think these waves of fervor, let's say, did also play a role, and sometimes aligned Christian parties on one side and Muslim parties on the other.
Okay, okay. So we're here to talk about partition truces today. How many of those 120 odd agreements that Friedman um, found were partition truces, do you think?
So in my kind of initial foray into the question, I counted 36 agreements, and I think more or less the number is around that much, at least in terms of what we can tell from the surviving evidence. There may have been many more. There may have been also small scale partition truces between, say, a single Frankish town and a single Muslim town. Um, but other partition truces were negotiated between political entities like the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Ayyubid Sultanate, or between groups like the Hospitallers or the Templars and the Sultans of Cairo.
Okay, so we only know about those ones which were recorded in the sources, which I guess is fairly obvious. So obviously, if they weren't then recorded in the source material, they wouldn't we won't know about them. So in that case, what types of sources do we have for these partition truces?
Right, for the 90 or so years following the First Crusade, we have to rely almost exclusively on chronicles, Arabic and Latin, that provide descriptions of these of truces that contained clauses establishing partitions. Because technically speaking, there's no truce centered on a partition negotiated in the period. Rather, partitions or the division of revenue was embedded within truce agreements. So yes, we have to usually rely on chronicles, and as you mentioned, we have some other kinds of sources like Ibn Jubair, who actually witnessed a partition agreement in action, so to speak, on the ground.
Okay. And
This changes a bit. Oh yes,
no, I was just wondering, could you just say a little bit about what chronicles are, just very briefly?
of course. So both on the Christian side and on the Muslim side, there were individuals often in the service of rulers, or often involved in other occupations, who took up the craft of history writing, um, and and uh, and ended up writing extensive chronicles, basically chronicling the events that they were witnessing or drawing on earlier material to
Okay.
to create their narratives, to compile their narratives. And we have a few of these chronicles that extend from the beginning of time, so to speak, or from the beginning of Christian or Islamic time up to the time of the authors.
Mm.
And for this period in question, the chronicles tend to cover, say, the 12th and 13th centuries, or the time periods of the authors in far greater detail. And many of them were interested in political events and diplomacy, and so they tended to record the negotiation of agreements.
But these are narrative sources about what happened, basically.
Right.
Okay, okay, great. Okay, now you say that the partition truces are embedded most of the time um, in broader peace agreements. What do we know about those broader peace agreements?
Um, so there, as I mentioned, there are a range of types of agreements. So there are truces and treaties, for example. There are alliances. There are also, as I mentioned, surrender agreements and guarantees of safe passage. When it comes to the truces, fundamentally, we're looking at a sort of temporary ceasefire or temporary peace. And this is what differentiates a truce from a treaty, which would be considered a permanent peace. So truces in this period, negotiated between Frankish and Muslim rulers, tended to last for a number of years in most cases. And in many cases from the 13th century, they would last up to 10 years, or they would be intended to last up to 10 years.
Okay.
And within the truces, there would be other kinds of clauses protecting the inhabitants of the territories, for example, protecting people that were in transit between territories, or that regulated conflict or the collection of revenue.
Okay, thanks. I think I interrupted you there when you were talking about the actual source material. So I'll just go back to that. So with regard to the other source material, apart from Chronicles, you mentioned Chronicles were particularly for the 12th century. What was it like for the 13th century?
Yeah, so the 13th century is really interesting because we start to have actual copies of diplomatic agreements, which preserve the clauses contained in the agreements. And these copies, when it comes to truces, these copies exist in Arabic chronicles and transfer materials. So some of those chroniclers we were talking about not only related what they saw and drew on earlier material, but they also actually copied official documents sometimes into their works. So we have quite reliable copies of agreements, in some cases multiple copies of the same agreements, which can then be compared. And these allow us to analyze the clauses contained therein.
I mean, from what you've said, it sounds like there are more Arabic language pieces of evidence than there are Latin pieces of evidence. Do you think that's correct?
Right. Thank you. You reminded me of what I was going to say, which is that when it comes to commercial agreements, we have quite a few copies actually negotiated between the Italian merchant communes like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, and the sultans of Cairo, and in some cases the Sultan of Aleppo as well. And these are preserved in Italian copies, either translations of the Arabic originals or later Italian translations. So the Italian actually varies sometimes between the medieval Italian and something closer to early modern Italian.
Okay, so we have quite a broad range of sources for these partition truces. So what kind of problems do you encounter when actually dealing with them and trying to reconstruct what happened with these partition truces?
Right. I think the major problem is figuring out how they actually worked on the ground, because even though we have the Arabic copies, as I mentioned, and the clauses that pertain to the partitioned territory, they don't go into too much detail. So there are, for example, references to processes of conflict resolution. So if there's if harm is caused to the inhabitants of a partition territory, for example, there's a process. The witnesses have to be brought forth, an oath has to be sworn, and the governor of that area has to kind of take responsibility over trying to figure out what happened. But that's all we know. We don't really know how these governors were appointed, where they were located, what the actual court procedure looked like. Same thing for taxation. We know that revenues were supposed to be divided, and in some cases, it wasn't only the crops that were divided or the revenue from the crops. It was actually other things that were divided, like use of a mill, for example, or the mill, the grain that was milled, or the fish in a lake, as pointed out by Michael Köhler. There's even one case where, interestingly enough, there's a reference to Alei Nufar being divided in an agreement between, I believe, the Hospitallers and the Sultan Baybars. which the historian Peter Holt has translated as a place name, Alenufer, but which might actually refer to water lilies. So how they were divided, I'm not sure. But we don't know actually what this looked like on the ground. Like, were there tax collectors from both sides walking around and collecting the revenues? And I think what has to be done in both of these cases when it comes to taxation or conflict resolution is that we have to look at other sources, and that's kind of a next step in this research.
Okay, so then what do we know about the origins of these partition truces? Are they something which the Franks and Muslims kind of came up with themselves, or do they have some kind of pre-existence in the pre-crusading period?
Right. So as far as I know, the problem of the kind of the origins of the partition truces still remains to be solved. Um, the earliest Christian-Muslim partition that we know of was negotiated way before the Crusades in 688 by the Umayyad Caliph Abdulmalik and the Byzantine court. So that's too remote in time to really draw a direct link to what's happening just after the First Crusade. And then, as Joshua Prava has noted, there's evidence for a partition or a crop sharing agreement between the Fatimids of Egypt and the Seljuks around the area of Damascus. This is just prior to the First Crusade. So there we might have a precedent, but again, drawing a direct link is really tricky. In my research, I tried to show that the origins might lie in, on the one hand, specific circumstances of what's happening between the Frankish and Muslim polities around this time, but also in agreements on the one hand, tribute agreements between Frankish and Muslim rulers, and on the other hand, agreements between the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the merchant communes like Genoa and Venice. So when it comes to the tribute agreements, the Franks were already imposing tribute on their Muslim neighbors in the first decades after the First Crusade. So they were drawing a portion of revenues without actually conquering the territories that they were on which they were imposing that revenue. And this tended, at first, this was just a third of the tribute or a certain amount, but then I think this evolved into an equal division of the revenue. And in terms of the concessions that the kings of Jerusalem made to the merchant communes, they already had the concept of allowing Genoa, for example, or Venice to have a certain division of revenue in the territories that they conceded to the merchant communes. So I think these ideas might have come together and might have informed the kind of a mutual development of an idea of equally dividing then the revenue of a certain area of a certain region, or territory between the two parties.
So for the partition truces themselves, then what do we know about when and where and under what kind of circumstances they were agreed between the two sides?
Right. So I'll start with the geography of the partition truces. So they were often negotiated in frontier regions separating the Frankish and Muslim towns, regions that tended to produce high crop yields, but that were also vulnerable to frequent raiding. So both sides saw the risk in continuous raiding in these regions, but they also saw the potential of protecting these regions and the mutual benefit of coming to an agreement about sharing revenue. But it wasn't always the case. There were also important pasture areas, not necessarily located in frontier regions, that both sides also valued for herds for basically maintaining the herds of both sides. And then finally, very specific areas could be turned into partitions. So, for example, the Lake Homs was partitioned by the the ruler of Mosul and Aleppo, Zengi, but also between Zengi, the ruler of Mosul and Aleppo, and I believe it was Raymond II, the Count of Tripoli, in the 1140s. So that means, I believe that means that the fish in the lake, or the fishing rights, would be divided equally, as suggested by Michael Köhler. As for when these were negotiated, since they were always part of truce agreements, they were negotiated sporadically to uh, to end conflicts, basically, that occurred between Frankish and Muslim rulers, and they were negotiated throughout the period between the First Crusade and the conquest of the last bastions of the Franks in 1291. And in my research up to date, I've counted about 60 agreements negotiated between the Ayyubid sultans in particular and their Frankish neighbors between 1174, when they came into power in Egypt, and 1250, when they were when they lost power over Egypt. So that works to roughly about 8 agreements per decade. And then in the final half of the 13th century, when the Turkic sultans come into power and displace the Ayyubid sultans of Egypt, I counted about 30 agreements there. So that works to roughly about 9 agreements per decade.
Okay, but those agreements, though, can't have been partition truces, though, because you said there were 36 partition
Oh, yes.
truces overall. So out of those, for example, if we take the Ayyubid 60,
Right.
how many of those will have been partition truces?
I have yet to do that count, but yeah, my guess is about 5 of those. I think relatively few agreements in the Ayyubid period were partitions. I think more come from of course, there's a problem with the sources too. What survives? What do we know from the sources?
So can we see patterns of when these partition truces are happening? I mean, are there some more at the beginning of the crusading period, and maybe some at the end, and maybe not in the middle? I mean, how does that kind of work?
Um, yes, there is a shift actually. If you look at the first part of the 12th century, there's a high number of partition truces, kind of local truces between parties that are prone to raiding frequently, that are almost, you could say, almost involved in disputes or feuds. So Antioch and Aleppo is a good example.
So this
Damascus
is
and
in northern
Jerusalem.
Syria. So northern Syria and then
Yes.
southern Syria. Okay.
Yep, that's right. And there are quite a few of them just from the first couple of decades of the 12th century. But then when you have the Zengids start to consolidate their power, so Zengi, of course, takes control of both Mosul and Aleppo in the 1140s, I believe in the 1140s. And then his successor, Nur-ad-Din ibn Zengi, is able to then incorporate Damascus into the Zengid polity. They're actually less willing to negotiate partition truces with the neighboring Franks. So, to my knowledge, I believe there's only 1 or 2 partition truces dating from the Zengid period, and I believe this is because, as I tried to show in my own research, I think another factor in the development of these partition truces was the Franks' unwillingness to conquer a territory or lack of resources that would enable them to conquer a territory, and this kind of serving as a solution for them to extract revenue or extract tribute without having to protect or manage a newly conquered territory. So it's a way of extending their authority into another ruler's domains, but the Zengids will have none of it as much as they can.
Okay, so the Franks were able to essentially make partition truces with the Muslims because they were stronger. And then when you get into the Zengid period, the sides are more equal in strength, and therefore that's why you see fewer partition truces during that period.
Yes, I believe so, and I think this argument could apply to the Mamluk period as well.
Right. Okay. Of course, the Mamluks are extremely strong, much stronger than the Franks during that time, of course. So once a partition truce had been agreed, how long did they usually last for? In theory, anyway.
Yes, in theory. The earlier ones seem to have been negotiated for short periods, maybe a year or so, from basically one harvest season to the next harvest season. Um, but I think we'd have to look at the evidence a lot more systematically to try to figure out the timescales and compare them. Um, and then for the Mamluk period, they're often explicitly negotiated for a period of 10 years, and sometimes there's kind of an effort to match the Islamic and Christian calendars. So they will say that the agreement has been negotiated for 10 years, 10 months, and 10 days, for example.
Mhm.
Um, in terms of how long they actually last in practice, that's tricky because we don't always have the evidence for when the agreement ended, but we do have some chroniclers were really interested in noting when agreements were broken. So for a dozen or so agreements, we do know that they were broken before um, the date of termination determined by the two negotiating parties.
Hmm. Is that being broken by one side attacking the other? Because if they're part of a peace agreement, then I guess that would be the case.
Yes, that's right. Usually there's a violation of the truce. It seems to be most often the Franks. Um, and I would add though that this doesn't mean that the partition agreements didn't work or weren't seen as something as a valuable or viable solution to conflict and to protecting territories. I think they were negotiated over and over again repeatedly because they were seen to work and seen to be effective by both parties.
Is the accusation or the fact that it seems to be the Franks who violate the treaties most often, is that though simply a consequence of the fact that most of the source material we have for this kind of thing is Arabic Islamic material?
Yes, I've thought about that problem too, and actually, there are two kind of problems related to that, which is the first is that the chroniclers writing in Arabic are not always in agreement on who or when a truce was broken or the circumstances of the violation of a truce. Um, but I would say this is probably an accurate reflection of what's happening because we have even chroniclers on the Frankish side noting the violation of agreements. William of Tyre, for example, notes that Renaud of Châtillon broke an agreement between Jerusalem and the Ayyubids in the 1180s, infamously.
Yeah, William of Tyre didn't really like Reynard of Chatillon very much anyway, so perhaps that's not surprising.
Yeah.
So, what are the? I mean, you touched on this a little bit, I think, but what were the main features of these agreements, and maybe what were some of the unique features they had that maybe other agreements didn't have?
I think that the whole apparatus of administration and uh, divided into kind of taxation and conflict resolution are things that appear in the partition truces from the Mamluk period, but don't necessarily appear in other kinds of truces. Um, and I think the very concept of sovereignty, um, sorry, I should say the concept of authority in the partition areas being divided by the two rulers, that's something that's not really found in other agreements.
Okay. So then, with that in mind, what is the kind of purpose of agreements of this kind? What do both sides get out of making an agreement with the other?
Okay, for both sides, there is peace, first of all, and fundamentally. So they know that they can continue to collect revenue from a designated territory. Um, I think um, the other factor that I've alluded to, or the other advantage that I've alluded to, at least for one of the parties, is the ability to extend authority into um, into the territory of the treaty partner. So whichever party is dominant tends to impose its authority by, for example, having the appointment of a governor in the partition territory, without having to rule or possess, I should say, that territory directly. So they don't have the responsibility of protecting or maintaining that territory. This is what I've argued, and
So does that mean the
James
territory then
Wilson, and
becomes,
yeah.
sorry, does that mean the territory then almost becomes like a client state for that power?
Yes, yes, I would say so, and it could even be suggested that it's a step towards conquest.
Mm.
I wouldn't leave that out of the picture, and it's and in this regard, I think this is kind of another development that we see across the Mamluk period, which is that the um, the control exerted by the sultans of Cairo is reflected more and more in these documents in terms of the kinds of obligations that the Frankish side has. So I think that um, it without suggesting that conquest was inevitable, I think these could be seen as a stage in kind of the sultans of Cairo exerting more and more power and authority over territory.
Okay, if we go back to the 1110s, when I think some of the first of these ones are agreed between Damascus and the Kingdom of Jerusalem, they were happening at a time when the Kingdom of Jerusalem's military forces were primarily engaged with fighting against the Egyptians and trying to essentially remove, I guess, the Egyptians from Syria to the south, whereas Damascus was to the north of Jerusalem. So in that sense, I guess they could also be seen as being a kind of defensive measure to stop the army of Jerusalem having to fight on both sides, on both fronts.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a really good point, and I think this goes back to Mikhail Köhler's idea of the border stabilizing mechanism between two entities that do actively seek cooperation as well, and that are maybe not necessarily engaged or only interested in uh, in something that will prevent them from raiding constantly, but in developing something more meaningful, I guess.
Okay, okay. Thank you. So this kind of agreement is happening between two sides with very different cultural, religious, political backgrounds. And therefore, can we say that we can't really say that the Franks and the Muslims had the same legal framework in which they would understand these kind of agreements. So what is the legal framework, the legal understanding of both sides for these kind of agreements? Where did these legal frameworks originate from?
Right. Well, in my initial investigation, I suggested that the Franks and Muslims might have had different conceptions of what exactly was being taxed in the partition territory. So it seemed to me that the Franks, perhaps drawing on a medieval European tradition of charters and such kind of documents might have used land or the boundaries around land as kind of um, the parameters of what was being taxed, or as markers of what was being taxed. Whereas on the Muslim side, on the Islamic side, I posited that it was rather the specific sources of revenue within a demarcated territory that was the focus of taxation, or that were used as markers of what was to be taxed. So, for example, a garden or a mill. And this was based I mean, initially I looked at an agreement between the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Genoese negotiated in 1104, which granted the Genoese basically authority over certain properties in towns in the Kingdom of Jerusalem without specifying the exact sources of revenues from which they would benefit, but presumably would be all the sources of revenues contained within those properties. And I think both of these conceptions of say sources of taxation are reflected in the agreements from the Mamluk period, because you see clauses in the partition truces that describe both the demarcated territory within which the taxes were collected and then divided, but also the specific objects of taxation within that territory. Again, I refer to things like mills, gardens, ponds. But I think to really get to this matter, further research will be needed, and maybe a systematic analysis of on the one hand medieval European charters, and on the other documents, basically grants of iqta or tax grants from the Islamic side, as well as waqf or endowment deeds, and that would also specify the sources of revenue and kind of look at these in tandem, in comparison.
Okay, and that's research for the future.
It is. I'm not sure if it's my place to conduct that research, but I think definitely it's a fruitful area for understanding how these partitions were conceived and how they operated.
Okay, well, I think that's a very nice place to stop the conversation. So I'd like to thank you very much, Bogdan, for joining us today, and thank you very much for watching. If you have enjoyed this, please do like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. We'll be back with another discussion in a couple of weeks. Thank you very much.